Hello, welcome to Hari Sadhana 108. I'm Nirmala Rawat. Thank you for giving me your precious time. In last part, we saw two souls close to Mata Sita took birth in Ayodhya, named Anasuya and Ajit. They met for the first time as they are about to get married. To know more about Ajit, please listen to my previous video labeled Chapter 22, Part 10. Continuing chapter 23, Anasuya and Ajit are talking to each other about Ajit's grandmother. As I said, it is a long story, said Ajit. You see, when Raja Ram and Rajkumari Sita first rode into Ayodhya after their marriage, the whole city came out to see them. My grandmother was among that crowd. But what she saw was different from what the others saw. She didn't see a Rani. She saw a great Devi with a great light emanating from her. She saw Rajkumari Sita for who she truly is. And so, when they were forced into exile some months later, she realized that there was a far greater purpose to the exile, and it was not as people thought. She often said to me that the exile would not have happened unless Raja Ram and Rajkumari Sita deemed it necessary for their work. She also realized the dangers they would encounter, and so she began going down to the river before dawn to offer prayers and chants for them, especially for Rajkumari Sita's safety and well-being, and for the success of their mission. "That was your grandmother!" I exclaimed, interrupting him. Now I was piecing together the story, remembering what Soma had told us. He nodded. "You know about her?" he asked in a surprised tone. I nodded in amazement. "Please continue," I said. Throughout the 14 years, she didn't miss a morning. Through rain and thunder, sickness, and whatever difficulties she was facing, she went to the river to offer her prayers. I often wonder what motivated her to do so. She was a relatively poor woman with not much knowledge of the world, but she was a pure soul, the essence of goodness. She would never turn away a person in need. She always extended herself to help, never considering her own needs. That is how I remember my grandmother. Her husband had died not long after their marriage, and she was raising her son alone, her only child, my father. She struggled, but still she went down to the river every day before dawn, before the day's work began. Soon other women joined her, and by the end there were many who came, the women of Ayodhya. He fell silent after saying these words about his grandmother. I was now looking directly at him and saw clouds of emotion settle on his face. My heart went out to him. "You must have loved her very much, your grandmother?" He nodded. His voice displayed a slight tremble. When he began speaking again, "She had a great influence on me. And even though she died when I was quite young, I remember her well. I remember her by her deeds, not by her words, as she spoke little. But her life was an example to me." "Can you tell me how your grandmother came by this pendant?" "After the return from exile, my grandmother took quite ill. My father was seeking some medicines for her when Rajkumari Sita happened to be passing in her chariot. When she saw my father, she quickly got down from the chariot and took him to where the plant medicines could be found along the riverside. She then asked that my grandmother come to see her when she was well enough. After her recovery, my grandmother tried several times to see Rajkumari Sita, but the guards wouldn't let her through. One day, Rajkumari Sita and her attendant visited my grandmother in disguise. It was then that Rajkumari Sita told my grandmother how she knew of her prayers and the prayers of the women of Ayodhya, and how these prayers had protected her during her captivity in Lanka. Then, to show her appreciation, she took off this pendant and placed it around my grandmother's neck. It was the most precious thing she owned, but she said there was no way to express gratitude for the service my grandmother had rendered. You can imagine what this meant to my grandmother, who never wanted any recognition or acknowledgement for what she had done. Then Rajkumari Sita told her that we don't know the effects of our prayers. They can have far greater impact than we can imagine. This is something my grandmother repeated to me again and again. So that was your grandmother? I murmured in disbelief. He nodded. My mother died when I was young, and so my grandmother cared for me during my early years. Up until that time, my father had been struggling. But after that visit of the Maharani, success came to him in everything he did. He became quite wealthy. But this never mattered to my grandmother. She never changed her way of life. My father eventually married again, and we moved into a much larger home. But she refused to shift. She said she always wanted to live as our Rani did. I could not believe what I was hearing. We were quiet for some time. I felt quite comfortable with him now, as if we were old friends, and so the silence was not an awkward one. I was even enjoying the space between words, the quiet that had now come between us. Jai Shri Ram. To understand this part better, please listen to my previous videos labeled Chapter 4, Part 3, Chapter 17, Part 3 and Part 4. Thank you. Jai Shri Ram. Let me know your views in comment section.